We had spent, I think, the last half hour yesterday talking about troubles we would have in this country. It wouldn't just be your roads, it would be much worse if we had the grid knocked down, that is, the power grid. And I mentioned the threats we have from somebody dropping an electromagnetic pulse weapon. And I brought up the fact that U.S. Senator Jim Risch, speaking at a hearing a couple of days ago in Washington, had been discussing some of these threats that the country faces. And we dealt mainly yesterday talking about the EMP, that is, electromagnetic pulse. But Senator Risch is more concerned, not just about that, but he's more concerned one other way you could do this. In fact, I heard this the other day. This is the second time the North Koreans have had a failure when they've launched a test missile in the last week. It's happened twice now, that they've had, well, twice in the last couple of weeks. There is a suggestion out there that the United States has perhaps introduced some sort of element through cyber warfare into the computer systems in North Korea. So now when they're launching their rockets, the rockets are failing. It wouldn't be the first time. The Iranian nuclear program was set back years because the United States, in conjunction with Israel, introduced something called Stuxnet into the centrifuges in Iran. And they spun wildly and then they broke and fell apart, even though the technicians were looking at readings that showed everything was fine. So this may have been done to curtail the nuclear program in North Korea at this point. It tells you, though, that the United States is also susceptible to some of these cyber attacks. It wouldn't have to be an EMP device exploding a few miles above Nebraska, but it could be somebody simply introducing something into our computer systems that would suddenly start shutting them down. And this was Senator Risch speaking at the hearing this week. Take a listen for a moment.
Obviously, we're always vulnerable, or not vulnerable, but at risk for some type of kinetic attack. But I'm convinced that the next major one that affects a large numbers of people is going to be cybersecurity. So it's important that we do talk about this and continue to work at it, because from everything we're told, we're running fast, but need to run faster to catch up to where we need to be.
He brought along a spokesman as well, one of the scientists from the Idaho National Labs, to talk about this very issue and how it could impact something as important as the research that goes on there. We have a caller with us. Caller, you're up next at 9:45 on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Back to the road problem real quick there, Bill. I don't have a problem with paying more taxes and gas taxes and all that, but I do not want to pay for bad work. Number one, from Arco clear to Salmon, the chip seal project failed. All the gravel come loose, and it's 45 miles an hour through that whole stretch. It could have cost millions of dollars to redo that. The second one is from Highway 75, from Sunbeam down about a mile stretch. $20-some million project. Clean up the rocks off the cliff hitting the road and everything. Total failure.
We had a couple of
now, and
it's
all got to be redone.
We had a couple of people bring up the other day, and maybe you can add to this, that if you drive out of state to Wyoming or Utah, they don't. Now, the winter there wasn't any better, from what I understand, than it was around here. But people are, I haven't seen it yet, but people claim that the roads are in better conditions in those states. So the question, if that's true, what do they do that we aren't doing here that we need to do?
Well, you can go to the Idaho Transportation Department and get some answers, because this is pretty close to $30 million screw-up. The taxpayers are going to have to pay to redo all this stuff. Our roads aren't lasting 10 years after they're being reconstructed in this state. Just ask some truckers to call in, you got to buy a pair of spurs to ride in a truck across the state of Idaho now, But it's ridiculous. Let's get there's an engineering problem, there's a construction problem, there's some kind of a problem with Idaho transportation. And the salt slurry they're putting on the roads is just making the roads totally fall apart. Everybody's seeing it, where they're using this stuff real heavy. The roads are literally melting from this salt they're putting on the road. And, here, what's this going to be, $1 billion screw up across the state of Idaho? If this salt's destroying the road surface? We got to get some answers. You just can't keep throwing money at all this stuff, because it's not getting better.
I thank you for the call. I remember being a very young reporter. It was a long, long time ago. And I was working in upstate New York, and a bridge about 40 miles south of the radio station, interstate, both sides had to be closed. And I drove down there. I just told the boss, I said, I'm going to go take a look at it. When I got down there, I clambered down the side of the canyon, and I found one of the state engineers. Got an interview with him, too. It is just, one of those days everything goes well. But he told me, he said, the problem with these bridges is that we dump so much salt on the roads that it corrodes the bridges much more quickly than it used to when they used sand in previous decades. However, the state had gotten to the point where everyone was so worried in all of these communities about liability from accidents that they started throwing down salt in just large, large numbers because, well, it does get the ice. Well, to a certain, when you get too cold, it doesn't work. But when you get to a certain temperature level, I think it's down to 10, it doesn't work at that point, or lower teens. But it would clear the roads, and people wanted to drive on black pavement. And if they had an accident and they decided to take you to civil court, they'd say, well, you didn't keep the roads clear. So their solution was keep throwing down tons of salt everywhere they could go, tons and tons and tons. Meanwhile, all of the vegetation died alongside the roads for back about 40, 50 feet. And that was the result of all of that. And I do realize that it gives you maybe a safer drive at the moment, but you're going to pay more for road repair, and your automobile is going to rust out in just a few years. We have a caller with us. Caller, you're up next on KLIX.
Yeah, Bill, I want to say amen to that last caller. I don't know about the salt, but yeah, I've been here since 1980 in that area. And like he said, we keep pouring money into this stuff. And like I said, the road, he said 10 years. It don't even last 10 years. They can put a stretch of road down and it's gone in a year.
Well, and I think we're seeing some of that, especially after this past winter.
Yes, yes. And I'm not sure about the salt. They have different material now other than salt that they could use that'll do just as good.
Thank you for the call. There was one material called calcium chloride, I believe it was, that was being promoted about 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago. It won't rust your automobile, and it won't rust bridges, and probably won't harm the road surfaces, but it does cost an arm and a leg compared to what a salt solution costs. You're up next, and you're on the air on Top Story.
Morning, Bill.
Morning.
Well, I think we need new management in our transportation service myself. I mean, you just look at just in our area, that bridge out there that goes over 93, the same year that they put the new one on the northbound side, the southbound side they hadn't replaced yet, and it got hit by an oversized vehicle, and they had to replace one lane. Well, instead of just tearing the whole thing down and putting a new bridge there and using the guy's insurance money to help pay for that, they repaired that bridge, and now the bridge is gone. And then if you go up in Boise, from the time that you start hitting Boise all the way until you almost get to Nampa, they rebuilt every one of those bridges because they had to add another lane to them. Every one of those bridges are gone. How much money did that actually cost us?
And and a good point there too, because I don't think anyone could project how much space they were going to need on those bridges. And once they were constructed, they may have been too small already. Our next caller joins us, and you're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Yeah, I'd like to add to this. I agree 100% with what's going on in our roads, but I don't think that's the end of it. I'm a business person. I own a business, and what I've noticed that started happening, I don't know, I'd say within the last half a dozen years or so, it's the purchasing department of the state of Idaho is taking a real heavy-handed approach to all these departments, and the departments take, for instance, the Idaho Department of Transportation. They can't go out on their own and award contracts. They have to go through the purchasing department, and the purchasing department is one, they go out to the absolute low bidder and give the bid out. And I say that because it happened to our company where we had a contract for 8 years, totally were competitive, and this last year we lost out to a total outsider, never had worked with the state before, and the purchasing department stripped out all the criteria and went solely based upon the dollar, the low cost. And we lost a contract. It was a $80 million contract over $2,000 is what it amounts to. And we had successfully serviced the state for 8 years and lost over $2,000. So they went with a totally unknown and no criteria at all to for the enforcement, and they went with low dollar. I think our problem in this state is the purchasing department. So if you talk to Idaho Transportation Department, I think they've got good, competent engineers, but their hands are tied by the purchasing department, state of Idaho. So I'll let it go at that.
What you've done is you've just said you get what you pay for.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And the purchasing department, they have a lot of turnover, and we deal with people there that don't have a clue, that are making decisions over multi-million-dollar contracts, and they only know one thing, and that's low dollar. And they're not. The purchasing department is not listening to their other departments. This thing is out of control at the state level when it comes to cost. They've totally thrown out any criteria or any ability for these departments to add in what they need to add in to make sure they're getting a good product. So that if you're looking at a fault, that's where it needs to start, right there at the purchasing department. And I think the governor needs to step in, and they need to get some sanity involved with what's going on. And this thing is going from bad to worse from what I can see. There's so much pressure on them from a budgetary standpoint that every time you turn around, they're talking about cutting taxes, and then the pressure comes on the purchasing department to get a better price, and then you get what you pay for. And so it's just a constant cycle that it's a downward spiral of what we're on, and something's got to stop. Well,
thank you for the call. It reminds me of when my daughter was a little girl, and we'd go out shopping on weekends, and occasionally I'd buy her a small doll, a Barbie doll or something. And we stopped in a store one day. I had been at the tractor store, and we stopped in a little store next door called Big Lots. I wanted to buy some cheap tape over there for wrapping presents and the like. And she was looking over some of the dolls, and they weren't really Barbie dolls. They were like some knockoff, and they were really cheap, and she wanted one of them. And I didn't really want to buy it for her, but, Dad, I bought it for her, and then she got it home, and it broke within a couple of weeks. You get what you pay for because it wasn't the same quality. You're up next. You're on the air on KLIX.
Yeah, I want to add to that also, road conditions. My uncle worked for a paving company, a local paving company here in the Magic Valley for 40 years, and I worked with him a couple of summers. And that's a fact. They take the lowest bidder, and, of course, it keeps them in business every 2 to 3 years or 4. They go back and redo them again. So I know that's a fact. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you much for the call. I'll squeeze one last caller in before we wrap up today. Coming up on 9:56, and caller, you're on Top Story.
Yes. Okay. I'm just adding to the same thing. I know for a fact that a local company was overlooked, like, a proven company. And then they brought in somebody else, and I guess I better not say who. And they have done the work here. But, as I drive around and see their trucks everywhere around southern Idaho, and then I see what becomes of the roads that they fixed, I don't know if the people inspecting their work are doing their job, because this stuff falls apart worse than it should be. I mean, this is not what I do, but I know the people that do it. And I'm going to say exactly what the last two callers said. This thing, I don't know what's going on with the state, but you got to call the governor. You got to raise hell, because this thing with these roads, we spent this money, and then they fall apart? And are they warrantying their work? What's the status with this? I'll hang up.
All good questions. I think I'm in the category. I think I've made it pretty clear in newspaper columns and on the air. And I'll qualify it. I don't like paying taxes. If I didn't have to, I'd probably take the easy way out. There's a lot of things we don't like in life, but we got to do them. But when it comes to roads and driving, I would be willing to pay more in order that we would get better work done and that we would have more permanence. The old line, pay me now or pay me later. I remember that fellow in the Fram oil filter commercial years ago saying that. And I'm a firm believer that, and as I've said before, if you have good roads, a lot of other things will fall into place, especially when it comes to commerce and economy. 9:58. We've got to take a break, and Rush Limbaugh will follow the news following 10 o'clock. And also coming up this afternoon, Sean Hannity at 1 following Fox News, Glenn Beck at 4, and Dave Ramsey at 7 o'clock tonight. Bill Colley saying, have a great day, and God willing, if the creek don't rise, I'll be back here tomorrow morning, Friday. We'll also be talking firearms with Todd Eccles between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning.